Hello, welcome back to the book club. You're here to discuss the ultimate deployment guide and get you prepared for deployment. Hi, I'm Lizanne Lightfoot, the seasoned spouse, and I'm here to guide you through your deployment preparation and your deployment journey. I've been through this many times with my husband, who's a Marine. We've been through 7 deployments together now. I started out as the girlfriend and then the fiance and the wife, and now I have 5 children, and he has been in the military for almost 20 years. So I'm so excited to be here with you and share some of the experiences and just the tips and tricks that will make your deployment go a little bit smoother and hopefully much easier. So this is session 3 of our book club, and today we are going to be discussing how to set a household budget and some important notes for home and car maintenance. These can all be found on pages 5 through 7 of your Ultimate Deployment Guide. If you're just joining us for the first time, welcome. So happy to have you here. Remember that you can grab your deployment guide as a paperback version, like the one that's right here. This is available on Amazon. You can also get it as a digital download if you're someone that prefers to either read it on screen or print it out and be able to put it in the binder and make your own notes on it. Either way, it's available to you. I want it to be a valuable resource to give you confidence and support through your deployment journey. So, before we begin talking about the logistics of budgeting, which is not the easiest deployment topic, I want to share a quick story about why it is important and why couples have to have budget conversations. I'm not a financial expert. I am not here to help you make your deployment budget. I strongly believe that this is a discussion that needs to happen between you and your service member. Whether you're married or not married, either way, there's probably some elements where your budgeting overlaps, your finances overlap, and the fact is that a lot of things change when the service member deploys. And some of the changes are not things that you might consider at first. And so I'll give an example of a time when budgeting was difficult for me during my husband's deployment. It was actually his 4th deployment, but it was the first time that we were married and had children while he was deployed, which is a very different situation from his prior deployments when I had my own job and my own income and my own apartment that I paid for on my own, and he was stationed on the other side of the country living in barracks, which essentially meant that all the money he earned during deployment, his paycheck, his combat pay, his hazard pay, all of that, essentially he got to keep. He had no bills, except I think he had a car payment and maybe a cell phone bill or something minor. But he was not paying for housing. He was not paying for major insurance or anything that would be a typical family bill. He did not have to maintain that while he was deployed. So that was his experience during his first 3 deployments. Now we reached deployment number 4. And at this time, I was actually home with our 2 young children. The second baby, was born just a couple weeks before he deployed, and the older child was only 18 months old. So they were actually both in diapers at the same time. I was not employed. I was staying home because our new duty station was fairly rural and there were not many job opportunities for me there. And it was a decision that we had made together. But the reality was that the household budget and expenditure was just completely different from what it had been during his previous deployments. And I tried. I was a very responsible mom. I'm not someone who likes to spend a lot of money. I don't do a lot of shopping. So I didn't have any guilt about my purchases or things that I was ordering. My concern was that because we had limited communication, he wasn't always aware of the big problems that came up during deployment. So I tried to write to him in letters. I let him know that at one point we had some major car trouble. The car was about 10 years old, so it's not unexpected, but we had thousands of dollars in repairs in our car. And I think we were able to talk about it, a couple times on the phone. He knew that it happened, but it didn't really register in his mind that those repairs were several months of his enlisted paycheck. And then at another point during that same deployment, I was taking classes online. Well, the toddler threw a sippy cup right into my laptop, which shattered the screen, and I was unable to use that computer for my homework assignments. So I had to buy a new laptop. Again, I didn't get anything super fancy or extravagant, but it was a large purchase that probably took up most of his paycheck that month. So there were several things like that that happened throughout the deployment: home maintenance, car maintenance, just taking care of babies and kids and diapers. And by the end of the deployment, we had saved some money, like we had agreed, and I had spent some of the money on large projects, like we had agreed. We were doing some home repair projects at the time. But it turned out that when he returned, he expected to have some type of magical deployment nest egg, like he'd had when he returned from his previous deployments when he wasn't married. And he hadn't expressed this. I didn't know this. It was just sort of an unwritten expectation because he had been through deployments before. And usually when he came back, he had thousands of dollars sitting in his bank account waiting for him. This time, he had a wife who'd been paying the mortgage, taking care of kids, fixing the vehicle and the home and everything else. And we did have savings, but it was not a giant nest egg. It was not fun deployment money to spend when he came home. And I think that caused a lot of disappointment for him. He wasn't angry with me. Again, I hadn't done anything irresponsible, but he was disappointed. And that hurt me because I felt like I had worked so hard during the deployment to take care of the kids, to be responsible, to make sacrifices. And so at the end, neither one of us was happy, even though both of us had worked hard and no one had really done anything wrong. So that was a major wake-up call to me, that in our subsequent deployments, even though we thought we had discussed things and gotten on the same page, that it was so important to really talk about the finances and look at the numbers and look at the reality. What are our costs going to be while the service member is deployed? And what is the family income going to be while the service member is deployed? And you might think that you understand the answers to that, but until you really sit down and crunch the numbers and look over them together, it could be that you both have very different expectations. So to avoid that disappointment and to avoid those frustrating conversations and trying to make those big stressful decisions during the deployment when I know you have such limited communication options, it's best to talk ahead of time, as far in advance as possible, and maybe several times if possible, to discuss your budget. So that's what we're going to do today. We're just going to do an overview of what a household budget could look like and why some things might change during the deployment. So as we go along, I'm happy to take your questions. You can leave them in the comments at any time. But first, I would like to hear from those who are watching. Just let me know, have you had any budget conversations with your service member, whether they've deployed yet or not? And are there any budget questions that you have as we're having this discussion today? So just keep those in mind as we go. So first, let's talk about, if you've never made a budget before, I know it can be intimidating and it's not a fun conversation, and a lot of couples avoid it. You don't have to use the worksheet that's in this book. Some people prefer to use an app that organizes things for you. Maybe your banking program has a nice color-coded app where you can put your different expenses in. Use that. Maybe your credit card company does some tracking for you. That can be really helpful. So I'm not saying you need to be wed to these pages and that this is the only way to make a budget, but this is a great way to visualize what your budget is going to be during deployment. And essentially, a household budget is as simple as figuring out the household income, which is this section here, and comparing the income to the household expenses, which are these pages. Now, you might think that that sounds very simple. And the reason that it is so important to discuss this before deployment is that often the household income for either you or your service member will change during the deployment. The service member might not expect that their pay would change during deployment because they're not expecting to lose rank or to lose any income. But the reality is, for a lot of National Guard and Reserve families, if your service member is currently working in a civilian job with a steady, good paycheck, they may see a pay cut for their active duty pay during the deployment. It's possible that the employer would make up that gap, but they're not legally obligated to do so. So it's very important, especially for National Guard and Reserve families, to look at that income difference and have that conversation with the employer as early as possible. You may also expect that some people talk about extra deployment money. Now, the fact is that every time a service member deploys, they don't always make extra money. They can, depending what part of the world they're going to and what type of deployment they're doing. So the reality is that combat deployments do have a bonus pay. It's called hazardous duty pay, and they receive hazardous duty pay when they are in certain geographic locations for a certain amount of time. So depending what branch you're in, this can be a lot more pronounced than others. If you are Army or Marines and you deploy, your service member deploys to Afghanistan or to Iraq, for example, they're almost guaranteed to receive that combat hazard pay bonus throughout the deployment. However, if they're on a Navy ship going to different parts of the world, it's possible to receive hazardous duty pay for just 1 month when they're in one area of the world and not to receive it for the rest of the deployment. So it's a conversation that the service member needs to have with their chain of command. The chain of command is usually up front and able to give you some of those numbers. The other thing to consider is that sometimes if there is no hazardous duty pay and there is no separation pay is for married service members who are away from their spouse for more than 30 days. So the first 30 days of deployment, it doesn't kick in, and it's not until a full 30 days after they've gone that they start to receive a separation pay every month that they are deployed. Again, you have to be legally married, and the service member has to register the marriage certificate in order to receive that pay. So that would happen regardless of what part of the world they went to if they were married. That's the way that you would see an increase in the service member's pay. But sometimes the problem is that service members have almost a decrease in their pay during deployment. That can happen when a service member goes to a non-combat zone, so they're not receiving that hazardous duty pay. They do receive the separation pay, which is a few $100s a month, but they are also charged for their meals. And the amount that's charged for the meals is sometimes more than the separation pay. Usually when they're married, a service member is not charged for their meals. They receive a BAS, basic allowance for subsistence, I think, and that is calculated into their regular monthly pay. But depending what part of the world they are in, depending how the meals are going to work while they're deployed, if they get charged for their meals, if it's coming out of their paycheck automatically and being deducted, then they're going to see a decrease in their take-home pay. Also, in other locations, they end up having extra expenses. They might be paying for internet or for cable or for some type of service in the living location during their deployment. Internet access is not available at every deployment location, but sometimes it is, and sometimes they charge the service members by the month. So if they're doing that in addition to your regular utility, cable, phone bills at home, you're going to be paying double for some things. And that can really mess up the household budget. So that's why it's important to note any changes up or down in the service member's salary when they're going to deploy. And it's important to know also whether that's going to be a consistent number throughout every month of the deployment, or whether it'll change. They get the hazardous duty pay 1 month, but then they don't, and they're going to take meals out here, but not there. So the numbers can change, and when they do, it's very frustrating. Another thing to remember, and this is the last point for the income, is that your income as the spouse or as the significant other, your income might change during deployment. It's possible that you're going to go from a full-time job down to a part-time job because you are managing the household and the kids and taking care of everything you need to do, so you're going to work fewer hours. That's going to be reflected in your household income. Maybe you are taking time off from your job and you've decided to focus on school instead, which is a great thing to do, and I applaud that. But again, that's going to have an impact. So think about all the ways that your household income will change first. And then we get to the tricky part. This is where you and your service member have to sit down and have a very realistic conversation about your current household expenses. The categories I listed out here are not set in stone. It's not the only things you can spend money on in your house. These are just to kind of get your brain going and to think about how much do we spend each month. Obviously, you have your fixed expenses here. You can probably figure out how much your mortgage or your rent is consistently. That shouldn't be changing much. The same with car payments and any regular loan payments that you have, your internet, your cable bills, your cell phone. Sometimes your electric utility bills are the same, and then sometimes it might fluctuate if it's, you pay more for the air conditioning in the summer or the heat in the winter. So all of these subscriptions and regular set expenses on this side, these are called your fixed expenses. And even things like gas and groceries, which are going to change slightly from week to week, you can probably average it out by looking at your past credit card bills, your past two statements, and set a monthly guess on approximately what you're spending. Sure, sometimes you buy more snacks and sometimes you don't have to drive as far, but on average, you should know how much you're spending on gas and groceries each month. That brings us over to the variable expenses. And they're called variable because these are expenses that can change. These are things that aren't absolutely essential for your survival. And there's probably some flexibility. There might be parts of the year where you're not spending much on dining out and fast food. Maybe you're not buying as much clothing or shoes during certain months, but then other times of the year you have to redo your whole wardrobe all at once. So these expenses change. And this is where you can have the most control over your expenditure during deployment. So dining out and fast food. Maybe right now you and your service member love to order food and have, takeout traditions and favorite local restaurants and things like that. That's great. During deployment, do you think that you will do that more or less? Do you think that you are more likely to order food for yourself because you don't feel like cooking? Or do you think that you'll do it a lot less because you have your own dietary things that you want to follow and you're less likely to go dining out when your service member isn't here? So think about that. There's a service member entertainment fund, and I wrote it like that because during deployment, there are locations where the service member is able to go out and be a tourist, explore, do things. And you need to discuss realistically what is available in the family budget for that to happen. Some people take the attitude that, hey, it's a once in a lifetime experience. I might never be in this part of the world again. If I have a chance to go on a weekend trip, I might as well do it. And that's great. But other people look at it and say, you know what? It would be really cool to go to this new place and spend a weekend there, but I don't have $1,000 to spend on the airfare and the hotel and the food and the tour guide and all the things that we're planning to do. So maybe I need to pass on that excursion. I only have a certain amount to spend this month. So it's important to have that conversation and make sure that you and the service member have agreed on a reasonable entertainment fund kind of for both of you. Because we have a service member entertainment fund and a spouse entertainment fund. Maybe you're going to join a club or do some ladies' nights out or hang out with your friends or maybe go home and see your family. All of those expenses might be things that you're not spending money on right now and that you plan to add during deployment, which is perfectly healthy and normal to do. I'm not saying don't spend money. I'm just saying as you're planning to spend your money, have a way to track it and have that conversation so that when you do make those trips and those plans, that it can be something you can celebrate and enjoy and look forward to. And you don't have to have those awkward conversations with your service member of, hey, what do you mean you went home and spent some time with your family? I didn't know you were going to do that. We didn't have money for that airline ticket. And why are you trying to plan this fun evening with your friends that we don't have money for dining out right now? No one wants to hear and have that budget conversation when they're in the middle of trying to plan a fun social event. So have the conversations ahead of time so that you can set limits and then celebrate and make plans within your limits. And that way everyone's expectations will be met and you won't be disappointed. So as you look at your expenses, you also have to divide things out over the year. So if you are going to have any home or auto repairs, some people take the approach of, oh, I didn't know that my car was going to break, so I'm completely unprepared. I didn't have any money in savings for this. But the reality is that we can all expect something will go wrong with the house or with the car at some point. And it's unrealistic to think that we're just going to have a few $1,000s sitting around that month right away when it happens. So a better strategy is to save up maybe $100 a month, maybe whatever else you can manage in your family's budget. But if you're saving $100 a month for house and car repairs, that means by the end of a year, you'll have $1,200 liquid, flexible, ready to spend on something that goes wrong so that you don't have to be scrounging and putting it on credit cards and trying to figure out where to come up with the money. So some large purchases you need to plan out and spread that budget over the whole year as you're calculating your monthly spending plan. So you shouldn't be spending all of the household income on every single month. There should be savings, there should be some flexibility. And so that's why we have this chart on the bottom. Your total household income minus your fixed expenses, which are on this page, equals the amount of money that's left for your variable expenses and your savings. And so that's why it's so important to have that conversation with your service member about what are our plans for saving during deployment. Deployment is a really great time to tighten up the budget, to sock some money away for rainy days and for special activities. And you can save a lot of money during deployment, even when things are going wrong and even when there's problems. There's a lot of opportunities for saving. But it's important to make sure that you and your service member are in agreement about what those savings are for. If you think that you're saving money to pay down credit card bills or to pay off your mortgage faster or to pay down other debts like student loans that you've accumulated, you might be thinking that the money that you're saving during deployment is going to go toward those debts. And your service member might have a completely different view and think that they are for vacation or for, doing something as a family or taking a second honeymoon or doing something special when they come back from deployment. Well, there's only so much money and it can only be spent in so many ways. So you have to discuss it and agree on the best use of that deployment money. And if you're going to be in a situation like I described where there isn't as much money left at the end of the deployment, then you need to make sure that you and the service member are on the same page and aware of what the reality is. So if you've sat down and discussed, here's how much we're making and here's how much we're spending, and you're both tracking your expenses and being reasonable and being responsible, then there's no need to be disappointed and frustrated with each other. So again, I don't expect you to sit down and do all of the budget processing at once, but I do think that if you take the time to have this conversation with your service member and write down some of these numbers by looking over your past bills and checking out your credit card expenses, that not only are you going to have a lot smoother communication during your deployment, but you're also going to be setting a really good foundation for your marriage. Budget problems are not something that magically go away after a deployment ends. It's a conversation that you're going to return to again and again throughout your time together. So go ahead, take the time to fill that out now, ask your service member questions, and make sure that you do it in a friendly and non-confrontational way. Budgets don't have to be a give or take argument. You're not losing and giving in when you're working on a household budget. Think of it as a team activity where together you're trying to solve a mystery, solve a problem, put all the puzzle pieces together and make them fit in a way that makes sense for your family. When you look at it as a challenge that you're facing together, it takes away some of that struggle and animosity of if he gets this, then she needs to have that, and vice versa. So try to have a mutual beneficial conversation when you're working on your deployment budget. Now, I will say that, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not a financial expert. I do not have the ability to give you financial advice. However, when I made my deployment masterclass, I did interview a financial expert. a accountant who is able to handle taxes and all types of budgeting questions. Her name is Christine. She's a military spouse and she has been through multiple deployments. So I did a video interview with her. It's in our deployment masterclass. And she goes into such great detail about how to set up your family budget, where you can save money, how to tweak some of those things that we just discussed. So I just gave you a very general overview, but she gives a much more in-depth look at how to make a family budget and how to make it fit specifically for deployment. So if you haven't signed up for that deployment masterclass, I definitely encourage you to do that. You can watch Christine's budgeting video as well as 11 other video interviews with military spouses who discuss in each of their training sessions the major deployment challenges that spouses and significant others always seem to face during deployment. So I found experts in various fields, and Christine is the one that we interviewed on finances and budget. But we cover topics like raising kids during deployment and communicating with your spouse and what to cook during deployment, what to pack in care packages, dealing with reintegration and homecoming issues, and so much more. It's all covered in the Deployment Masterclass. And once you sign up for that class, it is self-paced video trainings that you can watch at any time before your deployment, during. You can rewatch them throughout the deployment whenever you need that advice and consolation on a particular topic. So that's all available in the Deployment Masterclass. I will drop a link in the comments for how you can watch those video trainings. But this is kind of just a taste of what's available in the Masterclass. So the last topic we're going to cover in this session today is page 7 in the book, which is home maintenance and car maintenance. And the reason these are included is because so many military spouses and loved ones struggle to maintain a home or a car or both while taking care of all the other stresses and responsibilities during deployment. I know you have a busy life. I know you have a job and school and kids and pets and family issues and medical concerns. And there's a lot going on right now. But I also know that some of these problems that come up in your home or your car can not only be incredibly stressful and frustrating during the deployment, but can also be very costly. And no one wants to deal with those unexpected bills and those unexpected hassles during deployment. So the good news for you is that there are things that you can do that are somewhat simple and easy to prevent having major issues in your house and your car during deployment. Now, of course, I can't guarantee that you're going to make it through a deployment without any car trouble at all when you follow these car maintenance tips. But I can tell you that this preventative maintenance for your home and your car can definitely save you in the long run. It can save you a lot of money and a lot of frustration. And hopefully you won't have to deal with those major repairs and issues when your service member is away. So let's talk about home maintenance. Some of this is for homeowners, yes, but also if you are renting or if you're even living on base and have that full-time maintenance staff available to you, you still need to be aware of some of these things. So don't think that just because you're renting or living in base housing that you don't need to pay attention to home maintenance. It is always beneficial before deployment to walk through the house with your service member and locate things like the breaker box. The breaker box is where all the fuses are, where if the power goes out, that's the first thing that you need to check to reset. The water turn-off valve. If you have an overflowing toilet or a leaking faucet, or like I once had, a bathtub faucet that just completely comes off and leaves the water gushing in the on position, you need to know where your house water turn-off valve is so that in an emergency you can shut that off and not flood your home. It's also important to look at your heating and cooling controls. Just familiarize yourself with where's your HVAC closet, where's the hot water heater, how do some of these things work, because maybe they'll all run smoothly and function just fine during deployment, or maybe something will randomly fall apart and break. And the more that you educate yourself about how they work, the quicker you can respond to a problem and the smoother it will be for you. So Walk through your house. If your service member is more handy than you are or more aware of these things, then ask them questions. If your service member is not familiar with those things and doesn't even know what they are or where to find them in your home, then see if you can ask your landlord or a maintenance person or, a parent, or go ahead and watch YouTube videos and figure them out. But it's important to ask these questions before you have a maintenance emergency. It's also important to discuss regular and upcoming maintenance tasks. Excuse me. The air filter in your home, for example. Every home, if you have heating or air conditioning, there's filters on those units. And some people don't know that because they're hidden, in the vents and in the walls, and you're not looking at it every day. But your air filter should be changed every 3 to 6 months. If you're a homeowner, you need to get your own. You have to buy them and replace them yourself. If you're a renter, that's something that you can request usually from your landlord, and they will bring you clean replacement filters, but you have to make that request. If you don't change your filters, not only are you breathing really dirty, dusty air, but it also makes all of the air conditioning and heating unit work so much harder, which means it's a lot more likely to break. So keep those clean and you won't have to worry about your AC going out in the middle of the summer. If you have oil or propane, then you want to check your tank levels for your heat. Make sure that you have enough oil or propane heat to get through the winter. You also need to clean out gutters in your home every 6 months. Gutters are designed to keep the water from overflowing and dripping on the side of your home, because the more that it does that, the more that it's likely to seep into your foundation and into your basement. Whereas with gutters, it takes all that rainwater and pushes it away from the house so it can drain safely to another part of the property. If your gutters aren't clean and they're just overflowing, then you're going to get water buildup right around the foundation of the home, which is dangerous. It can erode things, cause mold, cause just a lot of problems, and it can even leak into the house. So get the gutters cleaned out. Again, if you're a homeowner, you might have to pay someone to do that. You should not be climbing up on a ladder all by yourself during the deployment. But if you are renting or living on base, then you can ask your landlord or your property management company about whose responsibility that is. You also want to check your closets and your garage for mold. I know we all move around to different parts of the country, and so sometimes you're living in a different area than where you grew up. There are areas of the United States where it's very common to get mold, even in the winter months, because everything inside is warm and moist and everything outside is cold. Even in summer, you can get mold if there's just a moisture buildup in these dark spaces of your house. So check for mold regularly. It would appear as, little black spots on on the walls, sometimes around windows, around doors. Move the clothes and move the boxes that are in the back of your closets and just check to make sure, because breathing in mold spores is actually poisonous and it can cause a lot of health issues for you and anyone else in the house. You should know your household pest prevention plan. Again, different parts of the country have some really terrible bugs. Sometimes they're just a nuisance, and then other times they can actually destroy your home, like termites and things like that. So just ask the question if it's normal to have pest prevention in your area. You could talk to your neighbors, you could ask it on the local Facebook page, but find out what's standard, because you don't want to discover an infestation halfway through deployment. Whereas if you pay for a regular preventative plan, they usually come around and spray the perimeter of your house. You can do just the exterior, you can do exterior and interior, but just kind of keeping those bug issues down will mean that you'll have a much more relaxed and comfortable and safe experience in your home during the deployment. And finally, ask the question, who will mow the grass? Which, if you're a homeowner, it's your responsibility. Even when you live on base, sometimes the base will handle the front yard, but the residents are responsible for the backyard. And if you are renting, maybe your landlord covers that, but maybe they don't. You have to look at your rental agreement. So ask that before the service member leaves. There are some resources and companies that will provide grass mowing service during deployment for free. So that's a great resource to look up, but I think it is based on the family's income or the service member's rank. So not everyone qualifies for it. But there are some grass mowing services during deployment. A lot of times you can pay a neighborhood kid to help you out, but don't do what I did before I learned to ask for help and rely on other people. My husband left for deployment, and I was pregnant with our third child, living in North Carolina during the summer. The baby's due in August, so all summer long, it is hot and sticky and miserable in North Carolina. And I had a push mower to handle our lot. And it was a job that I didn't mind doing, before he left and before I was pregnant. But once I was 8 months pregnant, it became pretty exhausting and overwhelming and probably a little bit dangerous for a big pregnant woman to be out in that heat and losing so much liquid from sweating. So finally, some neighbors took pity on me and stepped in and just arranged taking turns to do it for me in the last month of my pregnancy, which I really appreciated. But the reality is that I probably could have asked them to do that much earlier and saved myself the health risks of, fainting and passing out during deployment when I'm taking care of other young kids at home. So don't push yourself to the limits. Don't do crazy things. You're allowed to ask for help. You're allowed to tell someone that you don't know how to do these things and you just want to get a second opinion or get a set of eyes on something in your home. People are usually happy to help if you ask them, but you have to make the request. Okay? So finally, we'll discuss car maintenance, and then if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Go ahead and leave them in the comments for me. Again, car maintenance, the more preventative maintenance that you do, you can save yourself a lot of money from having to replace a car battery or tires or some of these other things that can go wrong. So we all know we're supposed to change our oil. It says every 3,000 miles. Look at your manufacturer's recommendation, but you do need to check on that. You do need to keep on top of it, especially when you're the only one that's responsible and a driver in the house. Just schedule the time to do that oil change. And when they do that oil change, they will usually check your tire pressure, but do a visual inspection for yourself. Make sure that your treads are not worn down. The easiest way to get a flat tire and to ruin your day during a deployment is to let your tires wear too thin and let them bald. And if you can't stick a little coin in between your tire treads, if they've worn so flat that there's no longer a groove in between the treads, then you need new tires and it's dangerous to be driving on them that low. And to prevent that, you can also rotate and align your tires whenever you don't have to do it every oil change, but you could do it before deployment, and then it's probably good for about 6 months. So when you rotate the tires, it means that they will wear differently. If you have front wheel drive and back wheel drive vehicles, rear wheel drive vehicles, you want to be switching those tires out so that they will all wear evenly and they won't get those bald spots. The bald spots are most likely to cause a flat tire or even an accident. So pay attention to your tire treads and just give them a visual glance every now and then to make sure they're not balding. For a vehicle that you're not using, this would be your service member's vehicle, the one that they're just going to leave parked in the driveway or in the garage or in front of the house for the months while they are gone. An unused vehicle still needs to be maintained. And this is a running joke in my deployment group. We even have called it Start Your Spouse's Car Saturday, because you do need to turn on an engine and let it idle once a week for at least 10 minutes, preferably up to 30 minutes. And this is important not only to charge that battery. Every time that you turn on a car engine, you're charging the battery, but also letting it run and letting it idle pushes the oil and all those fluids throughout the engine. It lubricates everything and keeps it in good working order. If you let that car sit there for longer than a week or so without turning it on, the engine parts can start to rust, they can freeze up, they can be affected by the climate, and then it's very likely that the battery is going to die and you're stuck with a dead car. So you don't want that to happen. A better option is to drive it around the block. Again, that just keeps everything in the engine running and working just for a few minutes. Take it for a little spin. And when you park it, that also means that those tires are probably going to be in a different position. You don't want it to sit in the exact same spot on the exact same part of the tire throughout the entire deployment. So if you're comfortable driving your spouse's vehicle, then drive it around a little bit. You can even take it to run some errands for yourself. At the very least, move it up and down the driveway a little bit so that those tires will be in a different position. And while you're doing all that, check the gas level. If you're turning the car on and letting it idle, you are using a small amount of gas every time. So the level will go down throughout the deployment. Make sure that you don't run out of gas in the driveway. You may have to top it off and get it refilled at some point. At least once a month, you can take the car out for a longer ride, lend it to a friend. Make sure that it's getting some action in the engine to keep everything moving. You also want to keep an eye on that tire air pressure. Again, if they sit in the same spot, the tires can just bald in that spot and bulge and become dangerous. Check the oil level and run those windshield wipers because they dry out in the sun. So use some fluid, run the windshield wipers, and just keep them going. And then before your service member comes back from deployment, you can get an oil change. If you've been doing this maintenance throughout the time that they were gone, the car should still be in good working order. You won't need to replace the tires. You won't need to buy a brand new battery. You'll keep everything going and save yourself hundreds of dollars. If you don't do this, I can tell you from personal experience, and so can several other people in our deployment group, that yes, the battery will die and it costs over $100 to replace it. Yes, the tires can bulge and turn bald. And if you haven't moved it, then you have to buy a new set of tires, which also costs hundreds of dollars. So don't let that happen to you. Go ahead and do the car and the home maintenance that you need and save yourself all of that hassle and all of that expenditure during deployment. So that completes session 3 of our book club. I hope that you have learned a lot. I know that it was a ton to cover, but it gives you some great background on how to plan out your household budget, what to do to prevent that maintenance issues in your house and in your car, and hopefully will prevent you from having those stressful headache issues to come up during deployment. The more emergencies that we can avoid during deployment, the smoother and the happier everyone is going to be, and the more confident you're going to feel when you're taking the time to do these things. You will have that confidence to face issues when they come along. So, as always, if you're watching this on the replay, go ahead and leave me your questions in the comments. I'm happy to answer them at any time. Take the time to do those pages on your own. That was pages 5 through 7 in the Ultimate Deployment Guide. And I would love to see some of those checklists checked off and some of those budget items completed as we move forward. Our next sessions are going to start up again next week. We have a lot more to cover to prepare you for deployment, but the good news is we got a lot of the challenging topics out of the way this week. The beginning of the book, you'll notice the parts that we've already discussed. These have the most checklists, the most blanks, the most pages to fill in, and are really the most tedious. So next week, we get to talk about things that are a little bit more fun, like deciding where to live and building up your network of friends during deployment. So take the weekend to fill out those pages and do some of the homework that we've discussed. Send me your questions anytime, and I am here for you throughout your deployment journey. I'm Lizanne, the seasoned spouse, and I will see you in our next session.